Book 1, Chapter 29. Resurrection. Maslova reached her cell only at 6 in the evening, tired and footsore, having, unaccustomed as she was to walking, gone 10 miles on the stony road that day. She was crushed by the unexpectedly severe sentence and tormented by hunger. During the first interval of her trial, when the soldiers were eating bread and hard-boiled eggs in her presence, her mouth watered and she realized she was hungry, but considered it beneath her dignity to beg of them. 3 hours later, the desire to eat had passed, and she felt only weak. It was then she received the unexpected sentence. At first she thought she had made a mistake. She could not imagine herself as a convict in Siberia, and could not believe what she heard. But seeing the quiet, business-like faces of judges and jury, who heard this news as if it were perfectly natural and expected, she grew indignant, and proclaimed loudly to the whole court that she was not guilty. Finding that her cry was also taken as something natural and expected, and feeling incapable of altering matters, she was horror-struck and began to weep in despair, knowing that she must submit to the cruel and surprising injustice that had been done her. What astonished her most was that young men, or at any rate not old men, the same men who had always looked so approvingly at her, one of them, the public prosecutor, she had seen in quite a different humour, had condemned her. While she was sitting in the prisoner's room before the trial, and during the intervals, she saw these men looking in at the open door, pretending they had to pass there on some business, or enter the room and gaze on her with approval. And then, for some unknown reason, these same men had condemned her to hard labour, though she was innocent of the charge laid against her. At first she cried, but then quieted down and sat perfectly stunned in the prisoner's room, waiting to be led back. She wanted only 2 things now: tobacco and strong drink. In this state, Botchkova and Kartinkin found her when they were led into the same room after being sentenced. Botchkova began at once to scold her and call her a convict. "Well, what have you gained? Justified yourself, have you? What you have deserved, that you've got. Out in Siberia you'll give up your finery, no fear." Maslova sat with her hands inside her sleeves, hanging her head and looking in front of her at the dirty floor without moving, only saying, "I don't bother you, so don't you bother me. I don't bother you, do I?" She repeated this several times, and was silent again. She did brighten up a little when Botchkova and Kartinkin were led away, and an attendant brought her 3 roubles. "Are you Maslova?" he asked. "Here you are, a lady sent it to you," he said, giving her the money. "A lady? What lady?" "You just take it. I'm not going to talk to you. This money was sent by Kitaeva, the keeper of the house in which she used to live." As she was leaving the court she turned to the usher with the question whether she might give Maslova a little money. The usher said she might. Having got permission, she removed the 3-buttoned Swedish kid glove from her plump white hand, and from an elegant purse brought from the black folds of her silk skirt took a pile of coupons. In Russia, coupons cut off interest-bearing papers are often used as money. Just cut off from the interest-bearing papers which she had earned in her establishment. Chose one worth 2 roubles and 50 kopeck, added 2 20 and 1 10 kopeck coins, and gave all this to the usher. The usher called an attendant, and in his presence gave the money. "Please to give it accurately," said Karolina Albertovna Kitaeva. The attendant was hurt by her want of confidence, and that was why he treated Maslova so brusquely. Maslova was glad of the money, because it could give her the only thing she now desired. "If I could but get cigarettes and take a whiff," she said to herself, and all her thoughts centred on the one desire to smoke and drink. She longed for spirits so that she tasted them and felt the strength they would give her, and she greedily breathed in the air when the fumes of tobacco reached her from the door of a room that opened into the corridor. But she had to wait long, for the secretary, who should have given the order for her to go, forgot about the prisoners, while talking and even disputing with one of the advocates about the article forbidden by the censor. At last, about 5 o'clock, she was allowed to go, and was led away through the back door by her escort, the Nijni man and the Chuvash. Then, still within the entrance to the law courts, she gave them 50 kopeck, asking them to get her 2 rolls and some cigarettes. The Chuvash laughed, took the money, and said, "All right, I'll get 'em," and really got her the rolls and the cigarettes, and honestly returned the change. She was not allowed to smoke on the way, and, with her craving unsatisfied, she continued her way to the prison. When she was brought to the gate of the prison, 100 convicts who had arrived by rail were being led in. The convicts, bearded, clean-shaven, old, young, Russians, foreigners, some with their heads shaved and rattling with the chains on their feet, filled the ante-room with dust, noise, and an acid smell of perspiration. Passing Maslova, all the convicts looked at her, and some came up to her and brushed her as they passed. "Hi, here's a wench, a fine one," said one. "My respects to you, miss," said another, winking at her. One dark man with a moustache, the rest of his face and the back of his head clean shaved, rattling with his chains and catching her feet in them, sprang near and embraced her. "What? Don't you know your chum? Come, come, don't give yourself airs," showing his teeth and his eyes glittering when she pushed him away. "You rascal, what are you up to?" shouted the inspector's assistant, coming in from behind. The convict shrank back and jumped away. The assistant assailed Maslova. "What are you here for?" Maslova was going to say she had been brought back from the law courts, but she was so tired that she did not care to speak. "She has returned from the law courts, sir," said one of the soldiers, coming forward with his fingers lifted to his cap. "Well, hand her over to the chief warder. I won't have this sort of thing." "Yes, sir." "Sokolov, take her in," shouted the assistant inspector. The chief warder came up, gave Maslova a slap on the shoulder, and making a sign with his head for her to follow, led her into the corridor of the women's ward. There she was searched, and as nothing prohibited was found on her, she had hidden her box of cigarettes inside a roll. She was led to the cell she had left in the morning. End of Book 1, Chapter 29. Resurrection by Leo Tolstoy. Book 1, Chapter 30. The cell in which Maslova was imprisoned was a large room, 21 feet long and 10 feet broad. It had 2 windows and a large stove. 2/3 of the space were taken up by shelves used as beds. The planks they were made of had warped and shrunk. Opposite the door hung a dark-coloured icon with a wax candle sticking to it and a bunch of everlastings hanging down from it. By the door to the right there was a dark spot on the floor, on which stood a stinking tub. The inspection had taken place, and the women were locked up for the night. The occupants of this room were 15 persons, including 3 children. It was still quite light. Only 2 of the women were lying down. A consumptive woman imprisoned for theft, and an idiot who spent most of her time in sleep, and who was arrested because she had no passport. The consumptive woman was not asleep, but lay with wide-open eyes, her cloak folded under her head, trying to keep back the phlegm that irritated her throat, and not to cough. Some of the other women, most of whom had nothing on but coarse brown holland chemises, stood looking out of the window at the convicts down in the yard, and some sat sewing. Among the latter was the old woman, Korobleva, who had seen Maslova off in the morning. She was a tall, strong, gloomy-looking woman. Her fair hair, which had begun to turn grey on the temples, hung down in a short plait. She was sentenced to hard labour in Siberia because she had killed her husband with an axe for making up to their daughter. She was at the head of the women in the cell, and found means of carrying on a trade in spirits with them. Besides her sat another woman sewing a coarse canvas sack. This was the wife of a railway watchman. There are small watchmen's cottages at distances of about 1 mile from each other along the Russian railways, and the watchmen, or their wives, have to meet every train. Imprisoned for 3 months because she did not come out with the flags to meet a train that was passing, and an accident had occurred. She was a short, snub-nosed woman with small black eyes, kind and talkative. The third of the women who were sewing was Theodosia, a quite young girl, white and rosy, very pretty, with bright child's eyes, and long fair plaits which she wore twisted round her head. She was in prison for attempting to poison her husband. She had done this immediately after her wedding. She had been given in marriage without her consent at the age of 16, because her husband would give her no peace. But in the 8 months during which she had been let out on bail, she had not only made it up with her husband, but come to love him, so that when her trial came, they were at heart and soul to one another. Although her husband, her father-in-law, but especially her mother-in-law, who had grown very fond of her, did all they could to get her acquitted, she was sentenced to hard labour in Siberia. The kind, merry, ever-smiling Theodosia had a place next Maslova's on the shelf bed, and had grown so fond of her that she took it upon herself as a duty to attend and wait on her. 2 other women were sitting without any work at the other end of the shelf bedstead. One was a woman of about 40, with a pale, thin face, who once probably had been very handsome. She sat with her baby at her thin white breast. The crime she had committed was that when a recruit was, according to the peasants' view, unlawfully taken from their village, and the people stopped the police officer and took the recruit away from him, she, an aunt of the lad unlawfully taken, was the first to catch hold of the bridle of the horse on which he was being carried off. The other, who sat doing nothing, was a kindly grey-haired old woman, hunched back and with a flat bosom. She sat behind the stove on the bed-shelf, and pretended to catch a fat 4-year-old boy who ran backwards and forwards in front of her, laughing gaily. This boy had only a little shirt on, and his hair was cut short. As he ran past the old woman, he kept repeating, "There! Haven't caught me!" This old woman and her son were accused of incendiarism. She bore her imprisonment with perfect cheerfulness, but was concerned about her son, and chiefly about her old man, who she feared would get into a terrible state with no one to wash for him. Besides these 7 women, there were 4 standing at one of the open windows, holding on to the iron bars. They were making signs and shouting to the convicts whom Maslova had met when returning to prison, and who were now passing through the yard. One of these women was big and heavy, with a flabby body, red hair, and freckled on her pale yellow face, her hands, and her fat neck. She shouted something in a loud, raucous voice and laughed hoarsely. This woman was serving her term for theft. Beside her stood an awkward, dark little woman, no bigger than a child of 10, with a long waist and very short legs, a red blotchy face, thick lips which did not hide her long teeth, and eyes too far apart. She broke by fits and starts into screeching laughter at what was going on in the yard. She was to be tried for stealing and incendiarism. They called her Koroshavka. Behind her, in a very dirty grey chemise, stood a thin, miserable-looking pregnant woman, who was to be tried for concealment of theft. This woman stood silent, but kept smiling with pleasure and approval at what was going on below. With these stood a peasant woman of medium height, the mother of the boy who was playing with the old woman, and of a 7-year-old girl. They were in prison with her because she had no one to leave them with. She was serving her term of imprisonment for illicit sale of spirits. She stood a little further from the window knitting a stocking, and though she listened to the other prisoners' words, she shook her head disapprovingly, frowned, and closed her eyes. But her 7-year-old daughter stood in her little chemise, her flaxen hair done up in a little pigtail, her blue eyes fixed, and, holding the red-haired woman by the skirt, attentively listened to the words of abuse that the women and the convicts flung at each other, and repeated them softly, as if learning them by heart. The 12th prisoner, who paid no attention to what was going on, was a very tall, stately girl, the daughter of a deacon, who had drowned her baby in a well. She went about with bare feet, wearing only a dirty chemise. The thick, short plait of her fair hair had come undone, and hung down, dishevelled, and she paced up and down the free space of the cell, not looking at anyone, turning abruptly every time she came up to the wall. End of Book 1, Chapter 30 of Resurrection by Leo Tolstoy. Translated by Louise Maud.